Mother's Intolerant Recipe. Upon my return from the Arrant Creek Red Beans and Collard Greens Festival, Captain Blowhard spray painted across my forehead, I reunited with my imaginary friend, Jerry Lancaster, and our puppet, Dr. Fungroid. I was immediately all business. "What's this about Mother's Intolerant Recipe?" I asked. "I haven't the slightest idea," Jerry replied. "Opened the paper this morning and there it was, plastered across the front page, big enough to be an announcement of intelligent life on another planet. But no story underneath, just the usual crap about life being uniquely created on this planet by the Christian God." "Sheep," Dr. Fungroid muttered angrily. "All right, that's enough about that," I squelched in a burgeoning bitch session. "I'm here to take control of the situation. I wish you would. It's getting out of hand. Here." Jerry handed me an alcohol prep pad to cleanse my forehead of my souvenir. "You think this is bad," I remarked, looking at the smears of red and black on the pad. "You should have seen Nicole Kidman's forehead. They painted a reproduction of L. Ron Hubbard's Apotheosis on it." "The one by Lucian Freud?" Dr. Fungroid asked. "No, Noirola." "Please," Jerry shuddered, "don't mention that woman and her horrifying forehead to me. It gives me the willies. You suffer from Nicole Kidmanophobia?" Dr. Fungroid asked. His interest went beyond the clinical. He was, in addition to being a devoted research scientist, an enthusiastic cineast. He once told me he had seen collegiate pranksters waste valuable time at least 30 times. "I think your Latin is a little off," I mused. "If you can claim to suffer from dysynephrenia, then I think I can diagnose our friend Jerry here in the aforementioned manner." Dr. Fungroid gestured towards the imaginary fellow with his little puppet hands. I nodded, admitting the truth of his statement. Wearily, I sought the sofa under the window through which one could look out on Honolulu, capital city of the tunnel system. Only recently constructed during my absence, I had not yet had time to inspect it, nor did I now. Turglev reviews 4 new gelatin molds. Stoneclaw Turglev reviewed the 4 new gelatin molds not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He was that kind of writer. Financial remuneration for his efforts had never been a significant factor to him. This wasn't just because of the fact that Turglev would write whether he was paid or not. It was also because he rarely was paid for anything he wrote. Don't blame the shallowness of the marketplace, however, for he rarely submitted anything for publication anyway. As he labored over the review, he smiled at the thought of sending the piece in to some serious literary magazine like Sargassa Review, Umlauts, or the Eleemosynary. Even as he wrote of the earnest tactile qualities of the horse's hoof-shaped mold, he fantasized about having his work interpreted as allegorical. But an allegory for what, he wondered, looking up from the cheap spiral-bound notebook in which he wrote. There were 4 gelatin molds. There were also 4, races of man, major candy manufacturers, legs on a chair. Turglev scratched his chin. It could be something more personal, more subjective. For instance, he had had sexual intercourse with 4 women so far in his life. Each gelatin mold could stand for one of them. Actually, he had had sexual encounters with more than 4 women, but he had placed his penis inside the vaginas of only 4. That was a depressing thought, and it distracted him from his work. Turglev hammered out the rest of the review in a dry consumer's guide style at odds with the poetic, borderline surrealistic nature at its beginning. No submitting this one to a real magazine. It would just have to be one of those pieces that was discovered after his death and appreciated within the context of the sum total of his work. He ended with a non sequitur that expressed his feelings at that moment, and, he hoped, would have a random connection with the rest of the piece, one that would make some future reviewer of his work say, "Aha, what a clever man he was." Answering the knock on his door later in the day, he was surprised to find a package thrust into his hands by a uniformed delivery man. "But I didn't order any socks," he puzzled as he opened the package in the privacy of his book-lined chamber. This Friday sees the launch of the dentist's barge. My friends and I had taken a suite overlooking the harbor. From the balcony, we could see the dentist's barge in its berth. "Construction is almost complete," Dr. Fungroyd considered. It wouldn't be too difficult to drop some kind of incendiary device from here, Jerry suggested. He studied my profile as he spoke. What notions did my world-encompassing skull contain? The sea gives me the creeps, I said. The word marina alone is worth one sleepless night. You don't sleep at night, Jerry reminded me. I nodded. I've become nocturnal. Gentlemen, Dr. Fungroyd interjected, the barge will be launched on Friday. We need to come to a decision. I glanced at the calendar. Beneath the picture of Eric Dolphy as a bear lay the month of December, all stretched out like a maze of hospital corridors. That gives us 2 days, I said. Plenty of time to tailor our plans to the situation. I say, I looked my 2 friends in the eyes, we enjoy ourselves. Jerry picked up the phone. Shall I order pizza? He asked. No, Dr. Fungroyd answered, his stiff wooden hand coming down on the plungers. We'll eat later. Right now we need to spy on the dentist. I raised my eyebrows. Taking charge, are we? Well, okay. I'm not in a hurry to eat cheese anyway. The 3 of us put on disguises and ambled down to the small contractor's shack from which the dentist was overseeing the final phase of his barge's construction. I, dressed as a typical box of children's cereal, knocked on the door. Yes, a shapely young woman in a bamboo print catsuit answered. Are you interested in my prize? I asked, pointing at the front of my packaging. What is it? She asked as she looked me over. A race car powered by baking soda? Well, I don't know. Go on, urged Jerry, indistinguishable from a large snail. You don't have to eat the cereal first. Just dig your hands down to the bottom. No, Dr. Fungroyd objected. He was a Frenchman. That violates an implied social contract. Scope exceeds scale. Though far-ranging, the tunnel system is relatively small. In fact, it has been estimated that its entirety, excluding restrooms and infrastructural support chambers, of course, could be crammed into a space no larger than my grandmother's old bedroom. Naturally, I don't believe this, but seeing as how I read it in a book from a legitimate publisher, I am compelled to accept its veracity. So much for the testimony of my own perception. Still, the demands of my position require that I make periodic inspection tours of the tunnels, whether my subsequent reports of these tunnels are accepted as truth or not. But what is truth anyway? I mumbled as Jerry, Dr. Fungroyd, and I made our way along a purple hallway. Let's not get into that, please, the puppet begged. Truth is a word that has outlived its usefulness, like love, life, and money. I laughed at the profundity of Fungroyd's remark. Shh, Jerry cautioned. I think I hear something. That's only to be expected, I replied. There are bound to be people behind these doors. I waved at the purple doors that lined the hallway. Yes, but this was a scary sound. Jerry pointed to a particular door. Really? Like what? Like whale speech. Jerry made a strangled noise in his throat. In response, a noise came from behind the door. It didn't sound like whale speech to me, more like a bass fiddle bowed slowly with a sticky bow. Interesting, I said. We'll check it out. I reached for the knob. Jerry cuddled Dr. Fungroyd close, turning the knob slowly, just to be dramatic. I suddenly jerked the door open. An ocean of water, fresh and warm, poured into the hall, filling it in seconds and carrying me far away. When morning came, I found myself alive but soggy amid a mountain of soap bubbles. The tiles on the walls were sweaty, and the radio perched on the back of the toilet was proclaiming it another gorgeous day to be alive. But not soggy, the DJ added, as he put on some song by Blondie that I had felt ambivalence towards as a child. I will know the memory by its stickiness. I remember with much the same revulsion now as I felt then. My grandfather opening his mouth and the strings of saliva that hung between his jaws like something out of a horror comic book. I'm eating as I write this and getting a little sick, so I think we'll skip ahead to some other topic. It's bad enough that the chapstick on my lips got mixed up with my own mouth juices, and that my first bite of beans smeared off onto my spoon in a disgusting trail of snotty goop. Okay, on to some other topic. At the end of Barry's term of office, vengeful flocks of green birds wearing yellow helmets of a new polymer developed through an initiative sponsored by Barry streamed through the forest to the north, spraying the tree dwellers with their accumulated feces. It burns! It burns! Little Nakimo screamed, wiping desperately at her eyes. I noticed that the child's name ends in an O, a reporter with the Digby dugout said to Lord Tribum, chief of these tree-dwelling frauds. Yet she is a girl. Isn't that unusual? You reporters, laughed Lord Tribum. Always probing for any little piece of information that might shed a bad light on your subject. You sicken me. The old chief sat down on the sofa and acknowledged the entrance of one of his lieutenants. What news, Rabger? He asked. The birds are showing remarkable resistance to our feeble-ray weapons. It must be their helmets. Rabger, at one time apprenticed to Shagbo the rug puller, reported. Maybe so. Lord Trebham turned to the reporter. There's something worthwhile for you to look into, he said. Undoubtedly, the reporter agreed, the cynicism of his profession evident in his voice, and, later, the story he wrote about the attack of the birds. I can't print this, his editor complained, tossing the story down on the toilet seat. It makes it look like Barry had something to do with it. The connection is plain as day, Chief, the reporter insisted. Not to that little boy who was blinded, the cranky old editor growled before pushing the reporter out of the restroom. Blood under her nails. How's the investigation coming along? Winston Travesty asked as he sidled up to Lawrence Poulp. The latter bent over a microscope, a banana sandwich in his hand. You know, Poulp replied, pinching the bridge of his nose and holding the sandwich before Travesty's eyes. This is almost exactly the way my mom used to make these things. I'm glad you approve. Travesty, a 19-year veteran with the Grumpville Law Enforcement Ministry, did not sound glad. He sounded fatally constipated, but that was how he always sounded, so of course Poulp didn't feel compelled to include that observation in his diary. Now, Travesty continued, have you been able to match the blood under the victim's nails with that of Mr. Eggplant, this supposed cosmonaut? Poulp sighed, no. And before you're getting all huffy, he added, let me explain. Please do. Travesty folded his arms so that his identification badge was pressed into a tilted position, like a coffin about to be dumped into the sea. This blood, so-called, under her nails, it's nothing but common rust gravy. Poulp gestured toward the microscope. One of the banana slices fell out. He quickly shoved the rest of the sandwich into his mouth. What? Travesty demanded, the sides of his mouth rising up like the hands of a fisherman, illustrating an unusually large catch. Julia Wells clawed her murderer as she was attacked, and Julia Wells clawed her murderer as she was attacked. She got his blood under her nails. That's the only solid piece of evidence we have to tie this eggplant guy to her, and you tell me it's gravy? It is. Taste tests confirm it. Poulp was adamant, although the firmness of his words was somewhat negated by the wad of bread, mayonnaise, and banana around which he spoke. Travesty considered. I've got it, he pounced. The eggplant has gravy for blood. It would seem so, Poulp concurred, but there's more. It seems he actually was in space at the time of the murder. Taste tests confirm it. The clever bastard, Travesty declared. The listing of the Bacando's attributes. The early to mid-70s were a time of documentary films. Most of these documentaries featured the jazz fusion of Miles Davis or other composers/performers utilizing electrified trumpet and sitar. Their subject matter ranged from the paralysis of the traditional Jewish family confronted with the challenge of Mars to the production of chocolate-covered ants. Of course, the latter types of films usually featured incongruous ragtime snippets intercut with the fusion to liven up segments where the ants scrambled desperately to avoid the molten chocolate. One such documentary, The Listing of the Bacando's Attributes, is of particular interest to the aficionado of this era of documentary filmmaking. Although not released until 1978, and hence more properly ranked in the so-called Silver Age of documentaries, this film, like its companion film, Fireworks at the Funeral, was made by Helmut Crispblith, arguably the quintessential early to mid-70s documentary filmmaker. As the Listing of the Bacando's Attributes was Crispblith's last film, he died of a heroin overdose only weeks following the final editing of the film, it is only natural that we should group it with the main body of his work. There are those, however, who would have it otherwise. The film came out after 1976, argues Nel Shafetz Berzami, the director of haiku studies at the University of Sac-Lunch, and therefore clearly cannot be classified with the rest of the documentaries that you so strangely find compelling. I quote him from a brief but heated argument we had on the subject in the hallway outside the insurance commissioner's office. What's the film about? Wondered a bystander, a stocky man in the traditional attire of an ice cream vendor. It purports to show King Amilcrabo reading out a list of the Bacando's attributes, Berzami answered before I could. Reports, I repeated. Explain yourself, sir. That's not King Amalcrabo's voice, Burzami insisted. Crispell had an actor dub it in. That's a lie, I screamed. What's the picando? Our bystander wanted to know. The pants are ascribed to Quillamonker. Although Martha Whitehouse doubted the ascription Donguela had made, she said nothing, preferring to recall the half-dozen instances in which Donguela had been publicly proven wrong. There, she thought, I have successfully established my mental framework. Hopefully it will endure for the remainder of the conference. Across the table from Martha, Donguela, swathed in bandages, nodded her head slightly in either acknowledgment or approval, as Mrs. Grapunction read out Donguela's judgment to the ladies seated around the table. As she listened, Donguela's thoughts were only partly on the matter of the pants, for which the ladies had gathered. With the rest of her powers of concentration, which were considerable, despite the 2-year degree from the University of Sacklunch, which was the sum total of her education, she entertained a fantasy in which the sun, in the form of a man in an orange business suit, was punished for the nasty burn she had received 2 weeks before at Stapco. I am a lunar queen, she thought finally, as talk moved on to the hallmarks of the Quillamonker style. Until the early 80s, of course, when one said Quillamonker, one immediately thought of elongated pleats. Deborah Goosefarthing told them, gesturing elaborately with her hands as usual, much to the annoyance of Martha. But today, with his emphasis on heavy, inflexible corduroy, I think most people would just as soon forget all that they had ever they knew about Quillamonker. Martha dug a thumbnail into the dishwater softened, or coarsened, according to one's perspective, underside of her wrist, to help herself maintain that mental framework she so longed to be able to summon up whenever she needed it, which, now that Herbert was gone, seemed to be whenever she was in the presence of her fellow ladies. After the conference had broken up for the day, and the room was lethally slowly, Martha thought, being emptied, little Marie Opperkins approached Martha. What did you think of Jana's wig? Marie asked. I never think about such things, Martha lied. An exceptional person is our lordly bird. Some, the Rancourt brothers among them, felt that he was a pelican. Others, and I fell into this latter group, were convinced that he was of an artificial bird species, such as the flunker or the pinsnatcher. It is a testimony to the weight with which he lay, some might say nested, on our minds, that the debates between these two groups and among the minority opinion holders, such as those that felt he was a dog or only the embodiment of a mystic birdishness, were conducted at times when we should all have been working towards the establishment of our own groups of followers. Whether we adopted the guise of a bird or not in order to attain this goal was yet another refinement of the debate, and only went to further the lengths to which we would go to waste more time. As I say, the Rancourt brothers were in the opposition to me, and those of a similar mindset. Despite this, I cannot find fault with their devotion to the lordly bird, but I could badmouth them to the bird himself. To do so, I needed to travel to Hoshino, the island where our hero lived. Such was my hatred for Frank and Ronald that I was even willing to fly to get there. Perhaps I soothed my fears and justified my breach of principles by telling myself that I was emulating a bird by doing so. I don't remember now. All I can recall at this point is the excitement I felt at being the first among us to see the bird in person. Until now, we had only seen him in magazines and music videos. Bob Scrotal claimed to have spoken with the bird at a convention, but he had no proof that this ever took place. My first shock on being met at the island's tiny airport by Mr. Slather, who managed the island for the bird, was that he did not seem at all the kind of person that the bird would choose to associate with. His bones were not hollow. He carried a blind man's cane. Although pelican-like in appearance, Slather remarked as we were driven to the mountains of dignity, he is not a pelican, I can tell you that much. I rubbed my hands together in victory. Your gestures are wasted on me, Slather remonstrated without bitterness. There were delays, of course, but I bore them all easily enough, having brought along a book about someone totally different from the bird. Hesitation on the open range. The only weapon I usually carry, if I carry one at all, and if you don't count my hat, is a paralyzer cone. It shouldn't shock or inordinately thrill any of you to learn that I brought the paralyzer cone with me on my trip to the country. There are many wild animals there, hiding in the tall grass. Shoot! Shoot! Beater Swung cried as the mouse hippo charged from a canebrake. Alternately, Tomokos, the third member of our party, bellowed, "Fire! Fire!" Of course, the proper injunction is "Paralyze! Paralyze!" but I doubt if either man could ever become accustomed to uttering it, especially in such a dramatic situation as we found ourselves in. As it was, I did nothing, but allowed the beast to pass us by. "By God, Toadsglode," Beatus Swung declared, removing his pith helmet, "that was a close one." "Why didn't you fire?" Tomokos demanded as he pulled a flask of liquor from his trousers. "That thing could have killed all of us." He included our team of native guides in the circling gesture he made with his flask, something I didn't think his patrician blood would allow him. I didn't bother to correct his use of the term fire, but shook my head as I watched the dust swirl up to father-son in the wake of the Mouse Hippo. "He probably knew the beast wasn't in rut fever," Beatus Swung suggested. He accepted Tomokos' offer of the flask. "How did you know, Toadsglode?" "I didn't," I replied. I waved away the flask and continued to scan the ground for yarn. Later that night in our camp under the ominous height of Alpha Rock, Tomokos started in again. "You've got to be ready to fire when something like that happens. The slightest hesitation and you could be dead." "You're right," I agreed. I removed the paralyzer cone from the pocket of my coat, hanging over the back of the chair. I aimed it at Tomokos and triggered the firing mechanism. Fire is the better word. "What have you done?" Beatus Swung gasped. "Sorry, Beatus Swung," I said, "but you see, I knew that Mouse Hippo. He taught me how to knit." The purpose little served by the seemingly old. The new cultural center resembled a zebra's hoof crashing down on a lady's handbag. It had been hoped that the building would rejuvenate interest in Slumpworth's downtown sector, but so far such hopes remained unrealized. The architect, Ned DeShibo, was persuaded to visit the building a year after it had opened to give a lecture on the evolution of its design. Civic leaders gave out that this was being done to answer the controversy over the center's design. In actuality, there was no controversy. Of course, some people thought it looked stupid and had said so publicly, but for the most part, no one cared one way or another. Perhaps if they scheduled some decent acts to perform at the center, Bucket McLean suggested to a friend, or invited some kind of exhibition or something people might actually want to see. "Well, they're hoping that people will come to see Ned DeShibo speak," McLean's friend, the actor Raymond Durable, reminded McLean. A vain hope. This is one last chance to raise awareness for the center. Stir up some fake controversy and see what happens. You've heard how much they're paying DeShibo to speak. "No. How much?" $175,000. "How much?" McLean goggled, mouth ajar. Now his sense of outrage was truly engaged. He marched down to the mayor's office, Durable in tow, and demanded to see the mayor. "I'm sorry, Mr. McLean," the young woman on duty was firm. "No one gets to see the mayor today." "But I'm a citizen," McLean insisted. "Hey, Bucket," Durable called. He was looking at a framed poster of upcoming cultural events. "Look at this." "Visions of Intolerable Wealth," McLean read aloud. "What's that?" "It's a play," Durable explained. "A controversial one, too." He glanced at the mayor's receptionist. "What game are they playing here?" he wondered aloud. Bucket McLean did not speculate. He was mentally preparing a jacket whose pockets will be full of tomatoes. His name is echoed in the stamped tin of the previous century. Unlike my earlier efforts at the creation of a marketable hero figure, Malcolm Jamaica made it out of committee to emerge as the sensation of the Christmas Time series fiction showcase. Everyone, including my traditional enemies, wanted to tell me how much they loved the whole Malcolm Jamaica premise. Of course, my assistants kept most of these people from bothering me, but I could see the hand-painted banners and hear the shouts of approbation. Saul mentioned a toy manufacturer from the Vinyl Belt, commented that he had never seen such a display of affection for a character that hadn't even officially appeared in any of the available media yet. "Who says he will?" I joked, and naturally was taken seriously by 6 of the dozen people gathered around. Shocked expressions vied with the knowing visages of those who had had more experience with my flippant manner. In truth, however, I had already sent Malcolm Jamaica on his first adventure. Titled Scuppernongs from Indubia 16, it was a novel dealing ostensibly with Jamaica's efforts to reconcile a young heiress with the primitive robot that had served as her caretaker during her time inside the egg of the dance. Of course, there was more to it than that, with many seemingly purposeless diversions and autobiographical commentary, as was typical of all my work to that point. I was holding this novel in abeyance until the critical moment, having only issued a one-page outline of the character thus far, a page taken up for the most part by a crude depiction of Malcolm Jamaica in ballpoint pen. As you can see, I explained to Jamaica in a quiet interlude between lectures to the showcase attendees, the remainder of the outline is merely random thoughts, fragments of conversation and the like. Then why are they all so taken with me? Jamaica tried to puzzle it out, leaning over the donuts on the table of refreshments. You should know that better than anyone else, I reminded him. After all, it says right here. I pointed to a copy of the outline. Heightened self-awareness. Maybe, Jamaica theorized, his noble head rising to stare into the vague reflection in the oak paneling. It's word of mouth. Maybe they've heard about my adventures. Maybe they've heard about my adventure of the jellied cardboard. I don't see how they could have, I said, seeing as how I haven't. 100 coated tablets. Ever suspicious, I poured out the baby aspirins on the bedspread and counted them. As promised on the label, there were indeed 100 coated tablets, but I still harbored doubts. And aren't doubts usually harbored? I mean, you don't shelter them or put them in the bank. About the pharmacist who had sold them to me. I examined the expiration date, but found nothing amiss, unless it was actually 2 years in the future. The calendar, one bearing pictures of chimpanzees in human clothing, posed in obvious stage sets, told me the year, but what if I had forgotten, or in a spasm of nostalgia simply refused to change it? Had my birthday been on, I consulted the proper month, Tuesday last year as well? Of course I couldn't remember. Who, outside some sort of Marilou Henner freak, would? I could remember the pharmacist's face. He looked astonishingly like Buck Owens. Of course, one could trust Buck Owens, but a pharmacist who looked like him, dressed in a polyester smock, working in a shoddy little store that used to sell comic books when I was a child, but no longer. I didn't think so. I thought about the real Buck Owens and his red, white, and blue guitar, declaring his devotion to grinning. The pharmacist had not grinned once, not even when I pointed out that the $5 bill I was handing him was an old one. It might have come out of D.B. Cooper's Hall, I joked, uncharacteristically for me, but then I had to do something to allay my nerves. What do you need the aspirin for? Mr. Not Owens asked. What do you want to know? I wondered. If you're suffering from migraines, he fixed me with a stare like a policeman just before he looks away in disregard for your answer. There are some much more powerful analgesics available over the counter now. I'm not suffering from migraines, I answered. Arrogance and outrage intermingled on my features as one can almost make out on the footage from the surveillance camera. If you say so. How's Roy Clark these days? I eyed him closely, triumphant in my stance. My only regret is that I did not count my change, but dropped it into my pocket to join my guitar pick, chapstick, and keys. Hank takes a breather. Before continuing with the second half of his public reading from my book, Nibble Nibble Mouskin, Hank announced a brief intermission and repaired to the rooftop where he could enjoy a refreshing drink in the sight of the sleepy city all around. I joined him there and asked him how he thought the reading was going. Did the audience seem responsive? It's always hard to judge these things, Hank replied. He sat on a rough, handmade stool, his back to the low wall that surrounded the rooftop and kept the children's pet pig from falling to its death among the rug merchants below. I noticed damn few laughs, I commented. Not that I'm faulting your reading, which is exemplary. I always enjoy hearing my stuff read aloud. I might have added, especially by a stranger, but I didn't want to rattle the man any more than necessary. After all, he owned the broadcasting equipment. It could be the way I'm reading it, Hank admitted. I see the work is more autobiography than anything else, and as your life is essentially tragic, I wanted to strike a more somber tone. You see my life as essentially tragic, I wondered? Sure. Sorry if that hit you the wrong way, but I thought from what I've read that you felt that way yourself. Of course, everyone does, even I. It's just, your doomed existence as a nobody, your delusions about yourself, the inability to shed those extra 20 pounds. Okay, I interrupted. I get the picture. Hank glanced at the door that led downstairs where one of the grad student flunkies stood tapping her watch. Time to head back, he said. Rising from the stool, he asked, You coming? In a minute. I want to digest all this. Nobody could say I wasn't bold. Save your self-pity for your work. It's funnier that way. With those bracing words, he strode away. I sat listening to the cries of the merchants below, astonished suddenly to hear the sound of laughter intermingling with the declamations of value. Charging down the stairs, my one thought was, That bastard!